Okay, today we're going to be talking about revising these drawings that we did on basic geometric forms earlier in the class. What I'm going to do though, I'm actually going to start off with a new drawing. So you can choose between whether you want to revise your earlier drawing or whether you actually just want to start a new drawing on a new page. So I like to skip at least one page between drawings in my sketchbook. Sometimes I'll even skip more than that if I'm working with wet materials, but I'll just go ahead and do this for now. All right, so the first thing that we did earlier was we knew we were going to draw multiple forms on this page. It doesn't really matter which quadrant you use to draw which form, but I'm going to go ahead and divide it up. So I did not divide that very evenly, but that's okay. All right, so I'm going to stick with the same areas to draw these different ones that I used before. So I'm going to do my circle over here, and that is the one that I'm going to do today. So of course it is 3D, so really it's not a circle. It's a sphere, but we're going to go ahead and we're going to start by drawing a circle to draw our sphere. So I want to draw a very perfect circle, and that was something that a lot of people struggled with last time. So I want you to use a compass, either a compass that you have that is made out of metal or plastic or whatever, and you bought from a store, or if you don't have one of those, you can make one out of a piece of paper. So you just take any small scrap of paper, and you're going to put 2 holes on it, and the distance between those 2 holes is going to be your radius. And that means that the whole circle will be twice as big. So something about like that will be about the size of the whole circle. So if I decide that maybe isn't quite big enough, I can make this a little bit bigger. Okay, so maybe it'll be this and this. Okay, it's just up to you about how big you want that to be. All right, and now I'm going to need to have 2 pencils that are sharpened fairly well. These ones have better points, so I'm going to use these. You do want the one that you're going to draw with to be the lighter one. So I've got one that's an HB, that's like a normal number 2 pencil. And then I've got one that's a 4B, and that's darker. So I'm going to put the 4B in the center, and I'm going to actually draw with this one. And the big thing here is you want to make sure that this is really poking all the way through and making a line. Oh, and mine is not. So I'm going to make sure I open up that hole a little bit more. Oh, it did for some of it. That's okay. I'm just going to restart. Oops. All right, and wherever I put this center one, that's going to be the center of my circle. So if you have to pick up your pencil, you can. The outside one, not the center one. All right, so mine got stuck a little bit, as you could see, and I have some places where it turned out kind of light. So you may have to try that a few times before you get it quite, exactly how you want it. But that works pretty well. All right, and if you need to try it a few times before you get it exactly right, that's fine. Okay, so now I've got my circle, and I want to make this sphere appear that it's on the table. So I'm going to put a horizontal line behind my sphere. And I want to make sure that this horizontal line is actually horizontal. So I want to make sure by comparing it to the side of the page that it's actually going to be horizontal. So I can make sure that this line here is lining up with the side of the page. Or I could use this part of the ruler, whatever is going to work the best for you. Okay, and I'm going to make sure that my line goes through the circle, not sitting, it should not sit underneath the circle. So it's only in little kids' drawings where the ground is right at the bottom of the figure or right at the bottom of the page. Usually when you look at something, that line of the table or whatever is a little bit higher up. That depends on your perspective from where you're sitting in relation to the object and the table and all of that. But basically, at a normal point of view, it's going to be somewhere up here or even up here or even up here, depending on how big your table is. Okay. Now I want to give this a shadow, and here's the big thing that people tend to do. They tend to think, okay, circular object, circular shadow, but your circular shadow is laying on a flat object. So just the same way that instead of drawing the top of something so that it's a circle, like we would do from an aerial view, when we have it at an angle like that, it's going to make an ellipse. All right, so when we're seeing the shadow on the table, it makes an ellipse. So I'm going to draw an ellipse. And exactly where that would start and where that would go and the exact shape of this, that's going to depend on a lot of different factors, like where the light is and the angle of the light. Here I've got my light coming from up on this side from somewhere, okay? And maybe a little bit behind. Okay, so now we know that the shadow is here, and then up here will be lighter on the ball, on the sphere, and then down here it's going to be getting darker. I'm actually going to start by shading outside of the sphere itself. All right, and here I'm going to make this fairly dark. So I could switch now the pencil I'm using. So I'm actually using a 4B now. You can, depending on what you have at home, you could be using an ebony pencil. All right, but something darker than that original number 2 pencil or HB pencil. Okay, so it's going to start out nice and dark near the circle, near the object that is casting the shadow. And notice I started shading right at that line and shaded out, but from there it might start getting a little bit lighter. Now notice here I'm actually making my marks move side to side. They're actually horizontal marks, and that's because they're sitting on a flat table. So the direction of the mark making can help me with making this table feel more flat. So I'm not shading a 3-dimensional object in this case. I'm shading a flat shadow that's on a 3D object that is a flat plane. And so notice too, I didn't give this a really hard edge. And if you do end up having kind of an outline showing, you want to actually get rid of that outline. So mine shows a little bit, you can't really see it in the video, but I'm actually getting rid of that. And if it were darker, I would get rid of that. So you can even do that before you shade your shadow. You can make that a little bit lighter. All right. And you can also do that at this point if you have a dark edge around your circle. The first thing I would do would be to lighten that up a little bit. I'm not going to erase mine entirely or even lighten it up that much for this video, because I want to make sure you can see it. And if it's very, very light, the camera will not pick it up. But you can make that very, very light by erasing it and just leaving it just dark enough for you to see, but very, very, very light. Okay, now here's an exception to the idea that I'm always going to start at the edge. Here, I'm going to start over here. And that's because along this area where the shadow is kind of touching the sphere, I want this to actually be light. This is going to be an area of reflected light, and it's going to be a little bit lighter than the darkest part of the ball. Now, the shading lines that I'm making are going to follow the line of the circle, the sphere. And we started our circle, our sphere with a circle. So all of my shading lines are going to move in a circle. All right, now not a crescent. I'm not going to have them cut off here. They're actually going to be a circle. Now, where does this reflected shadow end? It ends right where the actual shadow ends. So starting here, notice how I picked up the edge right where that shadow is. So we kind of do a flip-flop of what's light and what's dark. Here, the negative space is dark and the sphere is light. Here, the negative space is light and the sphere is dark. Okay, so your darkest part of the ball is going to be right here next to the reflected light. And then from there, you can have it start getting lighter as it moves up here. Now, where exactly your highlight is going to be just depends on, is this light source behind the ball? Is it next to the ball? Is it actually a little bit in front of the ball? We know it's kind of to the side and maybe a little bit behind because of how the shadow is falling. Now notice here, I don't want to cut that off, so I was close to making that feel more crescent-like. That's going to make it look weird. So I want to correct that by going over top of it and making sure my shading stays in like a complete circle. So notice it's getting lighter as it's moving up the surface. Now up here, I've got some different choices I can make. I could make this kind of dark along this edge, or I could actually leave this white along this edge, and I can make the background darker. So I'm going to actually show that choice. And since I already shaded this part way up, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make it as if that shadow kind of does go a little bit farther up the ball on that side. And this does not have to be even on the two different sides, by the way. So again, I didn't finish my shading on the ball, but I am already moving on to the negative space. Now, a big question I always get is, how far do I go in shading the background? Ultimately, it's up to you. You could shade this whole background in if you wanted to. But let's say the background is not super, super dark, or you just don't feel like shading the whole thing, whatever. All we really need to do is establish that the ball is lighter than the background. So it may be that we actually don't want to shade that much of it at all because it's a sunny day or whatever, and we actually have our light source. So maybe we don't want to shade that far at all. We can make this gradation kind of go very, very quickly from dark to light. We could even have decided to make this background not as dark as we did. That's just up to what you want to do. Okay, so notice even as I'm doing this, I may be going a little bit faster, but I'm keeping my mark making fairly small, about 1/2 inch for each little line, if you think about them as lines. And they're all moving in the same direction. Okay, now I'm going to return to doing the ball. So notice again, I had kind of a curve, like a slightly curved but flatter line there, and now I'm moving that up, and I have to go around this whole curve. And then again, it's kind of up to you how much of this you want to shade. But here at the edges of where this dark area is stopping, I do want to make sure that I have a smooth transition. I don't just go directly from light to dark, I use a gradation. Okay, and the same thing over here. So I don't want to make it dark right against the ball if the ball is going to be dark over here, but I don't want it to kind of stop altogether. So I'm just shading over here. So I can even start right here. So notice now I have switched directions, but just to follow that ground line, if you will. So I can overlap these, but I want to do it so that you don't really see the conflicting mark making. And then I'm going to get lighter and lighter as I move closer to the ball. And again, at this outer edge of the shading, I'm making it get lighter and lighter. So if I want, I can use a little hatching and cross hatching. That's what, again, we call it if I'm picking up my pencil instead of keeping it smooth. All right, and now I am finishing up by blending. Now notice I'm not blending across this line. I'm only blending up to the line and out. Same thing with this line. We want to keep those edges crisp. So that's what we were talking about in the box drawing as well. All right, now over here, I don't want to leave this completely white. So I'm going to intentionally bring my shading down. I can do that with this tool, or if I need to, I could do it with my pencil. But I also don't want this edge to get confused. All right, so I'm going to go back and make sure, however I've done this, to make that ball blended. I'm going to make sure I'm going to go back and make sure that that's done in such a way that that edge is still really nice. So I might have to go back and forth. I might have to erase a little bit. I might have to redraw a little bit. All right, whatever I have to do to make sure that that edge looks crisp and like the edge of a real ball and doesn't get too fuzzy in any different way, right? And notice too, I can also blend the shadow, including the edge, because with the shadow, it often doesn't have a crisp edge. Sometimes it does, depending on how bright the light is and a lot of different factors, but and how diffuse it is. If there's one really bright light, it might be a crisp edge to your shadow. All right, and then I can also make this either come up a little higher here, or I could say, hey, maybe the table's a little bit darker back here. That's really up to you, or if you were looking at an actual ball on a table, you would be able to look and see, hey, maybe the table is darker than the ball there. Over here, if I want to, I can shade the table a little bit too. And notice how all those lines are horizontal. And the blending tool doesn't necessarily take away all of that directionality. So you need to make sure that you've kept your blending kind of, or your mark making kind of clean and going one direction, because otherwise just blending it is not really going to fix it if you've made it very, very messy to start. So your blending tool is not magic. It's just a piece of paper that's folded in a precise way. So again, I'm just cleaning this up. Notice how I'm going back and forth. I'm using my pencil a little bit. I'm using the eraser a little bit. And I'm just going to keep working this until it looks really, really nice to me. It looks nice and smooth. As I'm adding the shading, I'm still going in that kind of circular direction. Sometimes, depending on how the light falls, you might see kind of a really bright spot here. So you could shade around that if you see one really, really bright spot. Could be a lot of different shapes. If it's, say, a rectangular window, it might be distorted to look kind of like that. So that would be like a rectangle that then has curved around the form of the ball. And again, we just want to make sure we don't want a really hard edge on that highlight necessarily. Sometimes you do, it just depends. And you also don't want to mess up the edge of the ball anywhere else. So I can blend some of these areas together. All right, now I've got a pretty decent drawing of a ball. And you may have thought that the ball was going to be super, super hard, but it wasn't really in the end. All right, I'm going to get rid of that to make this just look more realistic. If I want to, again, if I decide that this blending kind of happens, if this gradation happens too quickly, I could add more shading. I could go right up to the edge if I want. But again, it's really just up to you what you think looks nice and how long you have to spend on this drawing. So if I want to, I could have the shading go right up to this edge on all sides. I could even, if I want to, if I just want to make these look more delineated, I could shade up to the side on one part and not the other, just to kind of make this kind of stand out a little more. So notice, even before I blend it, it still looks pretty smooth. All right, so you can't have the mark making going every which way and then think that the blending tool is going to fix it. You have to be pretty controlled to begin with. Okay, there we are. I may be a bit of a perfectionist. That may be why I became an art teacher. Okay. Feel like I'm pretty good with this right now. I think I still want this to happen down there. Okay, and sometimes you can actually let the two grays touch each other. You just want to not get rid of all the contrast. Sometimes you actually even can get rid of all the contrast. But if you've implied the line elsewhere, it's okay. Okay. Thank you for your attention.